is that fine? Well, good evening. I can see much better this evening. It is good to have everyone here. Glad we can be here and study together. As I've been saying for the last couple weeks, we are now past our historical foray into all the things we've been looking at for the last several months. We're going to be looking at something new tonight. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I hope that was valuable to everyone. I know it was valuable to me and refreshed a lot of things as well for me. And it was ironic. I found out that I'm going to be teaching some of that material when I get to Brown Trail. That's going to be like the first semester that I start. So didn't know that when I started out, but that works out pretty well. I have material now to work with. So anyway, that was good. But we're going to start tonight on a different series, and we'll be doing this for at least a few months because there's just so much material we can work with, and I hope it will be very valuable. We're going to be going through this book, and when I say going through it, we're not just going to read it word for word. And in fact, I'm going to kind of maybe expound on some things or use some things and go a little bit of a deeper direction with some of it as we go through. But for the most part, we're going to be following the basic structure of this book up here called Tactics by Gregory Koukl, depending on how you say it. Now, I am not saying that you have to have this book to engage in class by any means. It'll be perfectly possible for us to engage. If you haven't read the book, that's just fine. However, I do encourage you to read this book if you get the chance, because we'll only be able to go through so much in terms of all the nuance and all the detail that he goes through. And it's just a wonderful book to have at your disposal and be able to pour over even when we're not in times like these, or to go back and reread or whatever as the case might be. I can't take any credit for coming across this book. This was originally introduced to me by a gentleman at camp that taught it to a lot of the kids, and the very first lesson that he did from it, I just sat there and I was like, where was this when I was their age? I could have used this because, as I've probably told several of y'all, when I was a teenager, I loved reading stuff on like apologetics and things like that, like proofs for God and ways to, think about and prove that God exists and all that kind of stuff. And I knew all the facts and all the knowledge about that. And I don't mean that braggingly. I just mean like I was really into that. I knew the facts part of it. I never really got any instruction on how to communicate that to others effectively. Now, I can just stand up in front of people and say it, right? I could maybe do that, but I never got the just like one-on-one conversation, how do we do this? So that's really what this is going to be about. It's going to be very practical, trying to get us in the mindset, and probably a different mindset from what we're used to, that will just be a way of talking to people about God and the things of God that, number one, I think will make us feel a lot more comfortable doing so. Number two, it will be a lot easier in the sense of we have a plan now instead of just going into it without much of a plan, as we tend to do. I know that's been my tendency. And just in general, maybe understand some concepts that we haven't considered before. So all that being said as introduction, I want us to think about one concept tonight as we move forward. Now, I'm hoping we're going to have a whole lot of back and forth and conversation discussion. So if there are any questions or comments, as I say always, please do feel free to bring those up. We're going to talk about one concept tonight as we get started with the idea. Now, honestly, tonight and next time are mainly pulled from like the foreword to the book. These are concepts he introduces just before he even gets into chapter 1, but I think it'll be very valuable for us to just kind of have these in mind as we go forward. So we're going to talk about a concept called taking the fort. Now let's start off with a scripture. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. Now, it's interesting. We see this kind of language a lot in the New Testament. And when I say this kind of language, I mean war language, battle language, military type language. There shouldn't be any question that Christianity, in a very real sense, is a spiritual war. Now, sometimes we forget and we don't live like it's a spiritual war, but as far as whether or not the Bible portrays it that way, there's no question. Constantly, over and over again. Notice he said, well, actually, that's the wrong one. He says also to Timothy, he talks about this idea of waging the good warfare. this is a war that we're in, that we have to fight. But it's not a war where, like we talked about, for example, with the Maccabean revolt or the later Jewish revolt, it's not a war where we actually go to war in a physical sense. This is a war of ideas. This is a spiritual war. That's the kind of war that we're in. But if we're in a war, and this is where we get to the name of the book, right? If we're in a war, do you have to have a plan when you go to war? I mean, you don't have to, right? There are battles that have happened where you just have two mobs of people crash into each other and hopefully your side comes out on top. But that's not really a good recipe for success. Generally speaking, the side that has the better plan is going to have a huge advantage. I've been reading, I think I told some of y'all, I've been reading a history of the Civil War recently, and one of the things that has fascinated me is the intersection of plans and strategy and communication that all have to go right for one side or the other to win in a specific battle. And if you track it down, a lot of the problem is bad planning and bad communication being part of this. Not really the strength or weakness of the army. It's the planning, it's the tactics, it's the communication, it's all these things. That's what happens when you don't have a plan, when you don't have a strategy. Well, if we're in a war, we need to have a strategy, don't we? We don't just need to rush in. We need to have a strategy. That's what I would argue, in part, Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 16. He says, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. What does it mean to be wise as serpents? Okay. They're quick. What else? Wise as serpents.
They're very aware of their surroundings just by their physical nature.
Ah, okay. How is the serpent in the garden described? Anybody remember? Beguiling, cunning. We think about animals in our culture, right? We kind of associate certain qualities. For us, owls are the wise ones, right? That's usually the ones we describe as being wise. If you remember the old Winnie the Pooh cartoons, owls over there blabbering about something that no one knows what he's talking about, using big fancy words, right? That's usually our association with wise. But really, the idea of wise here, they associated serpents all the way back to the beginning with Genesis, right? As being cunning, as being crafty, as having a plan that no one knows about, right? Behind the scenes. They're always in control in a sense because they always have a plan going on behind the scenes. Now, of course, in the garden, that's a bad thing because the serpent is working for the wrong side. But he's saying that kind of mindset of having a plan, knowing what's going on, not being oblivious or in the dark or ignorant, that's what we should be doing. At the same time, and this is where the garden, there's a big difference between us and the garden, innocent as doves. No part of that cunning should be used for anything bad. No part of that cunning should be disingenuous. But we need to have cunning. We need to have a plan. We need to have a strategy. We need to be aware and know what's going on, while at the same time having the purest motives with no ill intent. No intent to deceive, no intent to manipulate, no intent to do anything but try and help someone. So if we're in a fight, we've got to have that kind of cunning while still remembering what we're actually fighting for. How many wars have you heard of or studied or whatever the case might be where both sides say they're working for some positive, wholesome goal and they're really not, right? Even if we say we're trying to do something for Christ, that's where the innocent part comes in. But on the other hand, how many times have Christians tried with all the best intentions to do something, but they didn't have a plan, and so they just made things worse? You see what I'm saying? That's where we have to have both sides. But anyway, I don't want to get bogged down in that because I want us to talk about this idea of taking a fort. So I want you to put yourself in the mindset of a general. Congratulations, you now have your own army or some size of military forces at your disposal, okay? And your job is to take a fort. You see this fortification, whatever you want to imagine, whether it's a castle, whether it's like a Roman-type fortification, whether it's those forts that we put on the frontier to protect against the Indians, doesn't matter. You are going to take some kind of fort. What do you need to do to take that fort? What are your first thoughts? What needs to happen for you to get that fort?
What are the weak points?
See, Ralph over here is cheating because he's read some of the book already. But you're exactly right. What are the weak points? Thank you. If you attack a fortress, just head on. And we're talking not just like something that's already been damaged, maybe with artillery or something like that. We're talking about a strong fortification. What happens if you attack head on at their strong point? Your troops are going to melt away before they're, again, whatever time period we're talking about, whether it's arrows or bullets or whatever, your troops are just going to be mowed down. No, you find the weak spot, right? You don't ever attack a fortified position head on if you have another alternative, especially if they have a similar size of an army or a similar size of troops as you do. Now, if there's only one guy in the entire fort, okay, sure, you can attack head on, right? Because there's only one guy. But generally speaking, you don't do that. There's got to be a better way. Maybe there's a part of the fort, one section of the wall, that is weak literally, meaning the structure is weak, and maybe you can bring in a battering ram and knock it down. Or maybe there's a tunnel underneath, or you could dig a tunnel underneath. Or maybe you can find someone on the inside and convince them to help you out and let some people in. All sorts of ways that you can avoid just running straight into their fire. Well, that makes way more sense, right? I want us to think about that concept in terms of talking to people. Now, again, I want to reiterate, we're not talking here ever about being deceptive, being manipulative, anything like that. We're not talking about, let me find something that will emotionally manipulate them. Let me find that weak point, or let me find something that can just scare them to death so that I can, no, we're not talking about that. No. Do I understand? Are there emotions involved? Is there sometimes fear involved when you recognize you're in sin? Yes. But I'm not talking about playing on those things or manipulating using those things. We're talking about finding a way to get past their defenses. Because ultimately, whether they realize it or not, where do defenses against God's message come from? Who puts up defenses against God's message? The ones that don't want to hear it, but whether they realize it or not, is it really them who's doing that in a sense? The defense ultimately is powered by what Satan is trying to do with them. Remember, Satan is the one who's deceiving. So in a sense, while yes, they often are the ones putting up these defenses, that's really Satan working through them in a sense. I'm not talking about anything mystical. I'm just saying the idea is that we're trying to slip past those defenses because ultimately, whether they understand it or not, those defenses are working against them. Those defenses are keeping them from something they need. There are a lot of wars, going back to this, and y'all know I'm a history nerd, right? So I'm going into a lot of this stuff. I'm not going to stay on the history stuff the whole time. But there have been a lot of wars where you conquer by liberating. Have you ever heard that before? We're going to go and we're going to liberate this place. Well, a lot of times conquerors say that so that the liberated don't take it as badly. Okay? Usually what you're just doing is conquering. Now, I'm not saying every time, but there are occasions. Let's think about, for example, the thing that comes to mind right now, Poland. Let's think about Poland in World War II. There's two sides to that coin, right? On the one hand, Poland needed to be liberated from Nazi rule, especially we're thinking about all the atrocities that were being committed by the Nazis, especially against Jews and people like that. So in a sense, let's say the Americans had come in and removed the Nazis. Well, that would genuinely be liberation, I would argue. Guess who came into Poland, though? The Russians. Well, that's not really liberation. That's just out of the frying pan into the fire. So we're coming in to genuinely try and liberate because Jesus is the only one who can offer true freedom. But sometimes people put up defenses in part because they don't understand that or they don't believe that. You see, some people come in the name of Jesus, but they're not actually working on behalf of Jesus. They're working on behalf of themselves. So, again, we could get caught up in a lot of these analogies. The point here is that I'm trying to get us to think about, if I'm going to talk to someone who doesn't believe in either God at all or in what Scripture says in any way, I am essentially trying to attack a fortified position. They are going to some extent, be defensive. And I'm trying to get past that. I'm probably not going to succeed if I just lay into it. Instead, I need to think of a different approach. I need to think about Jesus' approach. When he entered the temple, the chief priests, the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Now, any of y'all ever taught in any capacity, or any of you who have done that rather, what is the problem with a yes or no question? I know this isn't one, but just humor me for a second. What's the problem with a yes or no question if you were trying to teach someone? I'm not saying they're always bad. Is there any drawback to a yes or no question?
They don't have to think about much. They can guess and have a 50-50 chance of getting it right.
Good. It doesn't put you in a position as a student where you really have to think that much. You just answer yes or no and you go on. Giving answers in general, short answers sometimes they're called on tests and things like that, can be the same way. If you're Jesus, is there an easy answer to this question? By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? God. Okay, any more questions? Let's move on. Right? This is the simplest answer ever. But Jesus doesn't answer God. Is that the correct answer? Yes. Jesus doesn't give him the answer. What does he do? Jesus answered them, "I also will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things." And then he proceeds to ask them a question. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from men? It's not a hard question to answer, meaning what they asked him. Why doesn't he just answer the question? Why does he instead respond to a question with a question?
Teaching them
How?
by having them question what they believe,
Ah,
then they had to come up with those reasons.
okay. Is it going to convince them if he says, God gave me this authority? Brick wall, soldiers, right? You've accomplished nothing. So he is finding a weak point. He is finding a way to break through their defenses, potentially at least, that isn't a frontal assault on a fortified position. He knows how things will go down if he just gives them the answer. So not only is he teaching, but he's using a method that is going to be more likely to succeed in removing their ability to defend their position. Now, do we know why they're doing this? We're told, right? They're trying to trap him. That's the whole point of this. He knows that, they know that, probably a lot of the people who are sitting there also know that, right? This isn't very subtle. But I want us to think in terms of our own experience. Because this is something we don't often understand when we're having conversations with people about topics of God and the Bible and morality and things like that. A lot of the times when people put objections to our faith out there, I'm not saying this is true of the person who's doing it. I'm saying whoever originally came up with the objection, a lot of times the objections to our faith are actually designed to bait us. Just like these teachers were trying to do with Jesus, a lot of the times those objections are designed to bait us into having a disadvantage in that conversation. I'll give you an example. You Christians, you members of the Church of Christ, do you believe that you're the only ones going to heaven? Now, how can we answer that? Give me some possible answers to that.
Why do you think that? Where did that come from? Because then you've got a frame of reference to go on. Because we get that a lot.
Mm-hmm. We do. But you just answered a question with a question. You're ahead, so we'll go back to you. How else might we answer it without employing the question for a question? I should have clarified that.
All members of the body of Christ will go to
Okay. We could just say, well, when I say the church, I'm not talking about some specific denominational type group. I'm talking about the church. All members of the church will go to heaven. So in that sense, yes, I do. How else might we answer the question? We could just shorten that and say, yes. Now that might give the wrong impression because, again, people think of the church sometimes as the denomination, even though it's not, so that might create more confusion. But what good is it going to do us in that conversation if we answer the question at all? If I answer the question, I'm not talking about with a question, I think Sherry is exactly on the right track. If I answer the question with a statement, have I helped the person gain a better understanding of anything?
Well, you sure can clarify in a bad way real quick. And then you've got somebody to shut down. I just think that as we've gone on through the years and us try to follow things through on the narrow, like we have, that somewhere along the line, others have gotten the idea that we're closed off. And because I've said, I don't know that everybody that goes to the Church of Christ is going to heaven.
And that's true.
We're working toward that. And, we're all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, regardless of where they go to church.
Okay, good.
And just kind of left it with that. And then to see, in the last month I asked somebody asked me, do you really believe that y'all are the only ones with the golden ticket? And I just said, for heavens no. I think we need to look more at the Bible and see what we think. Please don't judge us on one interaction you've had with someone.
Okay, good. Do we see how that kind of question puts us in that position? You see how that question's worded, right? It's what we sometimes call a loaded question. It means they're already projecting some assumptions onto you by asking that question. So if I respond to the question, what am I doing? I'm taking the bait. I'm falling into the trap. Now, I'm not saying anyone who asked that question is intentionally trying to trap me. Again, let me reiterate. The question itself, whoever initially came up with that question, that talking point, because that's really what it is, it was designed to function in that way. The person who's asking you that may not realize that's how it's designed. But that is how it works, whether or not they're intending to use it that way. It's designed to put you at a disadvantage. However you answer it, you're at a disadvantage in this conversation now. So what's better? What gave you that impression? What do you mean, Church of Christ? I'm getting ahead of myself, but we see the idea here. I'm diffusing the question before I even think about answering it, because the question itself is inherently unfair. Now, I'm not going to turn around and accuse them. Well, that's an unfair question. That's not going to accomplish anything either. Let's think about another one. Well, my grandma grew up and her whole life was a faithful member of XYZ religion, denomination, whatever. Are you saying that she's lost now that she's passed on believing that? What happens if you answer that question? Oh, we all know what happens, right? It's designed to put us at a disadvantage. Don't answer the question with a statement. Ask questions instead. Find the way that you can infiltrate their defenses. You realize what that is? That's an emotional defense. I'm going to try and bait you into making me mad, meaning the person who's asked that question. They're trying to get you to get them mad so they have an excuse not to listen to what you say. They may not realize that's what they're doing, but that's what that question does. So don't answer the question. Figure out a way to ask a question in return and get to the heart of what's actually going on. Now, you're like, well, I don't know how to do that. Well, that's why we're having these classes, right? We're going to go into a lot of detail as we move forward. I want us to get this concept down, though. My gut reaction when someone asks me a question is to answer the question. My gut reaction when someone brings up a topic is to start telling them what I know about that topic. If you're talking with someone who doesn't agree with you about God, about the Bible, about whatever it may be, that usually doesn't work. I'm not saying lie about it. I'm not saying don't be honest. I'm not saying be manipulative. I'm saying be strategic. That's what Jesus did. Jesus almost never answered questions just straight. I think I've told y'all before, one of my friends in college one time was talking not even about that, but about parables. Why on earth didn't Jesus just straight up tell us what he's trying to tell us instead of telling it in this weird way that we have to interpret through a parable? That's the point. He didn't tell it straight up because it was a more effective way of not only teaching, but getting past people's defenses that they would have just put up immediately if he just made a statement.
You can't handle the truth.
And we say that jokingly. I'm glad you bring that up. But is there a sense in which people may not be mature enough to handle certain things? So don't bring them up yet. If I try and talk to someone who knows very little about the Bible, who wants to maybe learn more about Jesus or something like that, what good is it going to do, just to pick a random example that unfortunately often comes up, what good is it going to do if I try and convince them instrumental music is sinful? What have I just done? I've given them truth they can't handle yet. I've accomplished nothing except probably push them further away. Let's keep going or else we'll never get through, because we could talk about so many things with this, but gotta save some of it for later. Instead of taking the bait, why not follow Jesus' example and ask questions? We're not inventing something. We're not avoiding anything that we should be doing. We're not doing any of that. We're literally following our Savior, the master teacher's example, in recognizing, you know what? I could respond in one of two ways. This way isn't wrong factually, but it's not going to work very well usually. This way not only is what Jesus often did, usually did, but it also is probably more likely to be successful in the long run. And I want us to think about this too, before we start wrapping up. When you ask a question, have you taken a side? You haven't told them your position. You just asked a question. But if you make a statement, what comes with a statement? Or at least what should come with a statement? Evidence. If I say the earth is flat, I'd better have evidence for that, or else people aren't going to believe me. If I say the earth is round, especially in a group where people hadn't heard that before, I'm thinking, when people first started recognizing the difference, I better have evidence for that. Anytime I make a statement, it's my job to back it up. I don't just get to say things and then go on. You know, I am going to be deathly ill, Liz, if you don't cook my favorite meal for me tonight. Oh, you better believe she's going to ask me certain evidence for that before she just goes and cooks my favorite meal, right? Anytime you make a statement, it's your job to back it up. So guess what? If someone else makes a statement about the Bible or Jesus or Christianity that you know creates an issue and indicates they need to know more, well, guess who is responsible to back up the claim? They are. They said it. So why would I make a statement that I need to back up when they already made a statement and I can start asking questions to try and get my foot in the door and create a dialogue? Otherwise, what have we done? Statement, statement, evidence, evidence. Now we're just back and forth each other's face, and we're probably never going to get to where we can just have a conversation because we've created conflict unnecessarily at the wrong time. Oh, there's going to be conflict eventually. Don't get me wrong. There can't be change without at least internal conflict. But the beginning is not the time to do that. The beginning is the time to ask questions. Not only that, and I'll just briefly mention this because we already mentioned it a little bit. If you ask questions, you might ask, well, what does that do for me to ask the questions? You're forcing the other person to think. Let me just throw out, let's just use the golden ticket idea, right? Every time I hear that phrase, I can't help thinking of Willy Wonka. But anyway, golden ticket, right? Do y'all think you're the ones that have the golden ticket? Have they thought about that question a lot, do you think? It's possible that they have. But it's more likely those kinds of questions, those kinds of statements, they heard it, it sounded good, sounded like, oh, got you with that one, and they repeated it. So if you try and ask them more information about it, guess what you're doing? You're making them have to think about something they might not have actually thought about what they just said. All right. One final thing. Isn't there more stuff that I need to say, though? You're saying all this about don't make statements, ask questions, all this kind of stuff, but I have a lot I need to tell them. They have a lot they need to learn. Yeah, they do. You're not wrong. Would you rather them actually learn it over a long enough period of time? Or would you rather push them away before you have the chance to get all of it out there? Yes, there's a sense of urgency when we're talking with people. You will never catch me denying that. But urgency and patience have to go hand in hand, or else this whole thing isn't going to work. It takes time to understand ideas you've never heard before. It takes time to correct worldviews that you never realized were incorrect. And you're going to be more effective, just like Jesus. Once again, let me remind us, this was Jesus' go-to, I would say, in many, many cases. You're going to be more effective in reaching people and actually opening a dialogue rather than just talking at them if you know when not to answer a question. That's going to lead us to next week. We're going to talk a little more about the concept of, well, but I want to get to the point where they know enough, become a Christian, etc. Yes, that is the end goal, but there's more to it than that. So for tonight, I just want us to think about this concept as we're beginning this study. In this spiritual war we're fighting, and God forbid we ever forget that we're in a spiritual war. The quickest way to lose the war is to forget you're fighting one in the first place. In this spiritual war we're fighting, it's often counterproductive to respond to every objection. And when I say respond, I mean make a statement, right? I'm not talking about asking questions. Sometimes instead of responding, we just need to ask questions. ultimately those questions will not only be things that help us learn more about what the person believes, but they can actually be used to let them tear down their own ideas. We're just guiding them in the process, oftentimes where they may not even really realize it. Again, not being deceptive or manipulative. We're just helping them work through something that they've never worked through before. But we have to first let go of the idea that anytime someone makes a statement or an accusation or anything like that about God and His Word, we got to let go of the idea, oh, I always have to respond. I always have to have a rebuttal. I always have to have a counter argument. Eventually, yes. But usually if you start out the gate with that, it doesn't work. Again, I'm so looking forward to this study as we continue. If there are any questions or comments, if you don't have them as we are talking in class, then please bring them up next time or to me personally or whatever, as the case might be. But I do think this is going to be so valuable for us. Any last comments or questions before we close?
886.
886 is the invitation. It is always open. We always want to be here to help one another. So as you turn to 886, if there is something that you would like prayers for or some way that we can help, please let us know as we stand and sing together.
What can wash away my sin?
Nothing but the blood of Jesus.